At 2 a.m. Gulf Standard Time on March 2, 2026, a senior commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast a message on the International Maritime Distress Frequency. Every ship within range heard it. The message was 4 words. The strait is closed. Every ship in the area would have heard that message, and it was enough for most ships to pause. By just after midnight, no tankers in the strait were broadcasting automatic identification system signals, indicating low or no traffic. Starting on March 4, 2026, Iranian forces declared the strait closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre reported 10 attacks on ships as of March 8 alone, killing 5 crew members on 2 vessels. In a single night, Iran did not fire a nuclear weapon. It did not invade a neighbor. It closed a 21-mile-wide channel of water, and in doing so, threatened to cut off 20% of the world's oil supply, strand 150 ships, and send energy markets into a spiral not seen since the 1970s. The clock is now running, and the window to stop it from getting much worse is closing fast. Washington's response came within hours. President Trump announced his intent to seize control of the Strait of Hormuz. On March 19, 2026, the United States Armed Forces began a military campaign to reopen the strait, but Iran did not back down. By March 27th, Brent crude had climbed back to $114 per barrel after the IRGC formally declared the strait closed once again following the failure of negotiations. Here is the brutal symmetry of this standoff. Iran cannot afford to keep the strait closed forever. It is strangling its own economy alongside the world's. But the United States cannot afford to let it stay closed either. Every additional week costs the global economy billions and brings the specter of $170 or even $200 oil closer to reality. A total shutdown of the strait by Iran would mean it was tightening the noose around its own neck, in the words of one maritime security analyst, because attacking shipping encourages the Gulf states to join the war against it. 2 sides, 1 choke point, the most consequential energy standoff in half a century. Today, we are going to break down exactly what is happening in and around the Strait of Hormuz and why it matters far beyond the Middle East. We will cover what the strait actually is and why no pipeline network on Earth can replace it, how Iran weaponized it step by step from February 28th onward, what the cascade of consequences looks like across oil, gas, fertilizer, food, and currency markets, which countries are already in crisis and which ones are next, and what the scenarios are from here, including the one that ends in $200 oil and a global recession. This is not an abstract geopolitical risk. It is already happening. The question is how bad it gets from here. Most people picture the Strait of Hormuz as a wide, open body of water. The reality is far more precarious. The strait is just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, forming a seaway passage between Iran and Oman. Its 2 unidirectional sea lanes facilitate the transit of around 20 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 20% of global seaborne oil trade. Roughly 27% of the world's maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products goes through the strait. That includes oil, liquefied natural gas, jet fuel, diesel, fertilizer feedstocks, and even helium. Here is what that actually means in human terms. In 2024, an estimated 84% of crude oil and condensate shipments through the strait were destined for Asian markets. China receives 1/3 of its oil through the strait. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through the strait, and up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. What for context, the Red Sea disruption caused by the Houthis in 2024 rattled global shipping and sent freight rates soaring. That disruption affected roughly 12% of world trade. The Strait of Hormuz carries nearly double that volume in energy alone. And unlike the Red Sea, there is no Cape of Good Hope equivalent to reroute around. You cannot sail around the Persian Gulf. This is the question every analyst reaches for first. The answer is partially, and not for long. Goldman Sachs research estimates that 4.2 million barrels per day of oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz can be redirected using existing spare pipeline capacities, implying around 16 million barrels per day of oil flows are at risk from a full closure. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline and the UAE's Fujairah pipeline are the two main alternatives. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline has a capacity of 7 million barrels per day, and the UAE's Fujairah pipeline offers a partial alternative. But terminal infrastructure at Jeddah limits actual throughput. These routes could sustain a portion of displaced volume, but would not offset a full strait closure. Most people miss this. The pipeline capacity that does exist is concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the same two countries now absorbing Iranian missile strikes. The oil production of Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE collectively dropped by a reported 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th, and by at least 10 million barrels per day as of March 12th. The pipelines exist. The countries that operate them are under attack. That is not a gap that strategic reserves can fill indefinitely. And here is the part that receives almost no attention in mainstream coverage. Iran does not need to physically block every ship to close the strait. It needs to make the insurance cost prohibitive. Insurance premiums had reached 6-year highs ahead of the strikes. The result was a de facto closure for most of the global shipping community, comparable in character to the Red Sea disruption, but with far larger volumes at stake. Protection and indemnity insurance, critical for shipping, had its war risk coverage removed for March 5th, making the economic risk too high for ship owners to use the strait. When insurers exit, ship owners stop. When ship owners stop, oil stops. Iran understood this mechanism precisely. It did not need to sink every tanker. It needed to sink enough of them and threaten enough others to make the actuarial math unworkable for every shipping company on Earth. Now comes the mathematics that most analysts are not yet discussing openly enough. Through roughly April 19th, analysts estimate the world has lost 4.5 to 5 million barrels per day of oil due to the war, amounting to about 5% of global supply. But that number is projected to double by mid-April, becoming the largest loss of crude supply ever recorded. Let us put that in dollar terms. A closure of the strait, removing close to 20% of global oil supplies during Q2 2026, is expected to raise the average WTI price of oil to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in that quarter alone. At $170 a barrel, as the impact on inflation and growth roughly doubles, a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path ahead for central banks to the outcome of elections across the Western world. U.S. government officials and Wall Street analysts are already beginning to consider the prospect that oil prices might surge to an unprecedented $200 a barrel, a number that, if reached and sustained, would trigger a global recession deeper than anything since 2008. The strategic asymmetry is this. Iran spent decades and billions building the military capacity to threaten this choke point. The United States and its allies spend approximately $2 million per day operating the naval forces required to keep it open in peacetime. Reopening it by force against active Iranian resistance carries costs in lives, ships, and an escalation risk that no Pentagon budget line fully captures. The IEA has characterized this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The head of the IEA called it the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not hyperbole. That is the institution whose entire purpose is tracking this exact metric. On March 23, 2026, President Trump posted on social media suggesting negotiations with Iran were progressing and that the war would end soon. Oil prices fell from $114 to $102 per barrel in response. 4 days later, the IRGC formally declared the strait closed again. Oil climbed back to $114. As a Financial Times investigation found that $580 million in bets on falling oil prices had been placed just 15 minutes before Trump published his statement, resulting in speculation about insider trading and calls for investigation. Here is what that gap tells us. There is a fundamental incoherence between the White House's public messaging, which is calibrated to calm markets, and the operational reality on the water, where Iran is still attacking ships. Those two things cannot both be true simultaneously. This is not a communications problem. It is a strategic coherence problem. Every time Trump talks prices down, Iran reminds the market that the ships still aren't moving. If the U.S. military campaign to reopen the strait succeeds within the next 2 to 3 weeks and Iran accepts a negotiated de-escalation, and the damage, while severe, is containable. If the disruption is limited to 1 quarter, the reduction in fourth quarter global GDP growth would be approximately 0.2 percentage points. Painful. A recession avoided. Markets stabilize. The IEA's emergency reserve release of 400 million barrels buys time. But here is what that scenario still leaves behind. Parts of the world's biggest LNG plant have already sustained missile damage, which owner Qatar Energy warned will take up to 5 years to repair. That is not a quick-fix problem. Europe's gas supply has been structurally damaged regardless of when the shooting stops. China, India, Japan, and South Korea, who collectively take 75% of Gulf oil, will spend years accelerating diversification away from Hormuz dependency. That permanently reshapes global energy flows. And if the strait remains closed for 2 or more quarters, the reduction in full-year global GDP growth could reach 1.3 percentage points. That is the threshold at which recession becomes the base case, not a tail risk. The conflict coincided with historically low European gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh 2025 to 2026 winter, causing Dutch TTF gas benchmarks to nearly double to over €60 per megawatt-hour by mid-March. The food cascade is already underway. Global fertilizer prices could average 15 to 20% higher during the first half of 2026 if the crisis continues. And unlike oil, the fertilizer sector has no internationally coordinated strategic reserves. The maritime blockade has also triggered a grocery supply emergency across Gulf Cooperation Council states, which rely on the strait for over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted, forcing retailers to airlift staples, resulting in a 40 to 120% spike in consumer prices. For third-party stakeholders, Russia benefits from every barrel of alternative supply it can sell at a premium. China is burning through its strategic reserve, estimated at roughly 1 billion barrels, and will need to make decisions about supply security that may force it into the diplomatic arena sooner than it prefers. The Gulf monarchies are in a genuinely unprecedented position. Their economies depend on a strait their neighbor has declared closed, and their own infrastructure is being struck. Neither scenario is clean. Pull back from the immediate crisis, and the significance becomes even larger. The post-1973 Middle East energy order rested on two assumptions. First, that the Strait of Hormuz was functionally open, guaranteed by American naval supremacy, and the implicit deterrence that any state closing it would face overwhelming retaliation. Second, that the Gulf monarchies, whatever their political differences with Washington, would remain stable custodians of the world's energy infrastructure. Both assumptions have now been tested and found to have limits. The war has caused what analysts are describing as a systemic collapse of the Gulf Cooperation Council economic model. An entire regional architecture built on stable energy exports, stable imports, and American security guarantees. That architecture is now fracturing in real time. The 1973 oil crisis lasted 5 months and caused a global recession, unlong fuel lines across the Western world, and a fundamental restructuring of energy policy that took decades to work through. That crisis involved a deliberate Arab oil embargo, a political decision by producers to restrict supply. What is happening now is different in character. It is the physical closure of the only exit from the world's largest oil reservoir, combined with active military attacks on the infrastructure surrounding it. For Russia, every day of high oil prices is a revenue windfall that partially offsets sanctions pressure. Moscow has no incentive to help resolve this quickly. For China, Beijing is watching its economic exposure to Hormuz crystallize into a genuine vulnerability. The lesson China is drawing, and will act on for the next decade, is that its energy security cannot depend on a strait it does not control and cannot defend. For the United States, the assumption that naval supremacy translates automatically into energy security has been exposed as incomplete. Controlling the water does not mean controlling the threat underneath it, in the air above it, or on the coastline beside it. The world is not going back to the pre-February 2026 energy order. The question now is what the replacement architecture looks like, and who gets to shape it. Here is where we are as of today. The strait is contested, but not fully open. Oil executives and analysts warn that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be reopened by mid-April, or supply disruptions will get significantly worse. And that even if it reopens soon, enough damage may have already been done to leave energy and many other prices higher for longer. The US and other governments have announced a record release of stockpiled oil. The IEA has coordinated a release that could reach 3 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are rerouting what they can through pipelines, but it is not clear how quickly all of those inventories are flowing to the market. The single variable that determines everything from here is time. Not military capability, not diplomatic skill. Time. Every additional week, the strait stays closed, pushes more of the world past the threshold from manageable disruption into structural crisis. Every additional week that oil stays above $110 reprices every other commodity that depends on it, which is to say, almost every commodity on Earth by mid-April, and we will know whether this is a severe but contained shock or the beginning of a stagflationary spiral that will reshape economies and governments across the developed and developing world alike. The question no one can cleanly answer right now is this: does Iran believe it has more to gain from holding the strait closed than from accepting a negotiated off-ramp? And does Washington have the leverage, the will, and the time to change that calculation? Leave your sharpest analysis in the comments. If you understand something about this crisis that the headlines are missing, the energy economics, the insurance mechanism, the fertilizer cascade, the political calculus in Tehran, this is where that conversation belongs. Subscribe and stay with us. The next development in this story does not wait for the news cycle.